Imagine this. You're walking through a crowded flea market on a gray afternoon. Most of the tables are piled high with chipped mugs, tangled jewelry, the kinds of ordinary things people sift through without much thought. But at one corner stall, stacked between brittle cookbooks and sun-faded magazines, you spot a leather-bound diary. It looks like it has been handled by too many hands, its spine cracked, its cover soft with age. The seller, bored and distracted, tells you you can have it for $20. No hesitation, no pitch to drive up the price, just a shrug, as if the book's weight means nothing. But when you pick it up, there is something about the heft of it, the smell. Old paper, faintly sweet and faintly sour, like dried flowers pressed between its pages decades ago. It feels alive, like an object that has kept watching long after everyone else stopped paying attention. You come away from that stall clutching it close, not out of pride in a bargain, but with the odd, quiet feeling that you weren't supposed to let it pass by. Back at home, you crack it open. The handwriting inside is neat at first glance, script that belonged to someone deliberate. The ink has browned with time but holds steady on the faded cream-colored pages. The first entry seems ordinary enough, dated, signed with simple initials. But then you see it, a line that pulls you out of the safety of chance discovery. They say the circle meets again tonight, but no one speaks their name. Simple words at first, yet the more you stare at them, the heavier they become. What circle? Why does the writer avoid giving them a name? And why does the entry feel less like a casual journal and more like a warning left tucked inside a private confession? Your pulse quickens, though the room around you is silent. That single phrase makes the diary no longer just an artifact. It's an entrance. It promises forbidden gatherings that happened in shadows, whispers of something no one dared put aloud. You feel, almost instantly, that you're trespassing on ground meant to stay covered. And here's the thing, your lap with the diary, a quiet battle more piercing than any sound. What unfolds from here is a story caught between the ordinary and the hidden. A student, barely aware of the undercurrents of the town around them, about to step into a shadow world most people passed by without looking. The diary will open its voice slowly, page by page, until it pulls that student and you into a forbidden history that was never supposed to surface again. You picture the student who carried that book home, not a collector in any professional sense, just someone who never quite fit into the social rhythm of campus. They lived mostly on the quiet edges of things, more likely to be found in the library's dim corners than in a crowded dining hall. It wasn't loneliness exactly, more a restless curiosity that had no patience for surface-level chatter. Objects, especially discarded ones, offered a kind of companionship that conversations with people sometimes couldn't. That's why flea markets held such a magnetic pull. For others, they were weekend distractions. For this student, they were living museums where forgotten fragments breathed again. Photographs with faces no one could name. Postcards heavy with stamps from vanished countries. Maps with roads that no longer existed. Each item was a puzzle piece belonging to stories untold. So when their eye fell on the leather-bound diary, $20 didn't feel like a purchase. It felt like adoption. The diary itself wasn't extravagant. If anything, it seemed deliberately plain. The leather had softened over what must have been decades of handling. Along the edges, it had grown almost furry, as though time had thinned it into fabric. Pressing it to the nose, the student caught not just the dry musk of paper, but the scent of something faintly metallic, faintly organic, hard to name. They ran their fingers across the spine, felt the notches where a pen might once have been tucked. Opening it carefully, they found nothing exotic at first. The beginning entries described a simple life in a small town, a person gardening in summer heat, the irritation of heavy rains spoiling a wheat harvest, Sunday dinners with family gathered around. There were notes on how the town school, noticing pauses between lines where the pen had clearly lifted mid-thought. It felt like reading not just what someone wrote, but how they breathed. Most nights, the student copied pieces onto their own notepad. Weather details, the cost of flour, a complaint about a neighbor's noisy horse. In those hours, the diary seemed safe. It was easy to imagine the author as just another resident, playing their part in a small rhythm of chores and gatherings. Easy to believe this was no more than a glimpse into lives long folded into history. That reassurance mattered to the student because they were used to skepticism about chasing the past. Friends already teased them for picking up junk instead of collectibles with clear value. Professors encouraged research, yes, but only when it fit neat categories. Oral history projects, census records, that sort of thing. A diary found at random was interesting, but never groundbreaking. So the student tucked into the pages without fear. Hours stretched as each entry unfolded, some short, some sprawling. A description of the smell of autumn leaves, an account of a sewing circle where neighbors gossiped about marriages and debts, a list of purchases from the general store, candles, sugar, nails. All the while, the thought remained still. This is a personal hobby, nothing extraordinary. They scribbled side notes to themselves. Compare wheat prices with regional records, or cross-check festival with county historical society. Every action pointed toward the safe routine of academic curiosity. Nothing yet suggested that danger could find its way into the margins of such an innocent book. But memory has its own pace, and words do not always announce their sharpness immediately. The student kept turning pages, feeling lulled into rhythm, just like a child hearing a bedtime story. It is only in hindsight, standing much later at the edge of fear, that they would look back and realize how carefully the diary set its trap. The harmless entries were an invitation, softening the reader, lowering their guard. That night, though, there was no trap in sight. Only the sweep of old handwriting looping across yellowed pages. Only the feeling of no explanation for it. No see diagram. No casual remark about what it represented. Just a quiet shape left there beside the words. The student stared at it long into the night. It was the first break in the rhythm of mundane life, the first signal that something else was pressing through these inked pages. They told themselves it might have been doodling or ornament, nothing more. And yet, as they turned more leaves, the symbols repeated, sometimes a circle, sometimes a set of overlapping triangles, sometimes a jagged line that looked closer to script from an unknown alphabet. Always small, always tucked between sentences that otherwise read like ordinary life. The pattern was hard to dismiss once it revealed itself. Suddenly, the diary felt less like a linear record and more like two stories woven together, one written in plain sentences for anyone to read, and another pulsing underneath, visible only through shapes and subtle cues. The shift grew stronger when the author began referencing gatherings. At first, the word appeared incidentally, a mention that a gathering on the outskirts had kept them away from supper. Another page casually noted that the gathering lasted longer than expected, but the night was kind. The diary never said who gathered, never clarified what the event actually was, and yet the repetition of that bare term, gathering, 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 stirred something unsettling. The student, intrigued, tried to place the dates of these entries against what little local history they could find online. They expected festivals or fairs to appear in newspapers of the time, but none did. The county records marked those particular weeks as uneventful. No listed church functions or harvest dances or public meetings. History stood silent where the diary insisted gatherings occurred. That contrast only deepened the sense that something was hidden. Papers of record omitted them, either by oversight or by some deliberate silence. Either way, the gatherings recorded in private script had no official counterpart to anchor them. What disturbed the student more was how the author's voice itself seemed to change around those nights. Early diary sections felt light, observational, but once the word gathering entered, everyday descriptions suddenly felt like camouflage, space filler, meant to keep prying eyes bored while, between the lines, a coded record survived. Curiosity widened into obsession. The student began to chart the symbols as they appeared. On loose paper, diagrams bloomed, circles connected with arrows, triangles placed beside dates. They pinned them above their desk with tacks, staring at them at odd hours. Slowly, a lattice of hidden meaning seemed to form, though its logic resisted clarity. The student noted how often the symbols accompanied certain days of the week, Thursdays and Saturdays, disproportionately frequent. They noticed how the edge of town appeared as a phrase, repeated with suspicious regularity, and they saw how the author used evasive terms, the circle, the quiet choir, they who move in silence. These phrases recurred like a chant, never varying, yet never explained. At night, with the dorm quiet, the student flipped between pages and found themselves wondering about the diarist's state of mind. Was this paranoia shaped into cryptic shorthand, or was it careful encoding of something very real left unspoken? Each possibility was unsettling in its own way. The diary's marginalia was the most tantalizing. Little notes, scrawled in faint pencil in corners, almost as though they had been added at a later time by the same hand, or perhaps another. Some were half-legible. Not safe. West Field. Leave bread. Others were fragmentary sketches of faces or hands, barely formed. The student traced them with their fingertip and felt an odd chill, as though touching the marks brought them too close to a person who once had to write quietly in shadows. There were entries describing seemingly ordinary chores that, once read in context, took on eerie resonance. Walked by the creek, saw no one. A harmless line, except that on the facing page, someone had drawn that sharp line symbol again, and the next day's entry read only, all returned. Returned from where? Returned from whom? The diary's gradual turn into obsession infected the student as well. They knew enough about archival work to sense when a pattern demanded firmly. This wasn't just an academic curiosity anymore. The diary contained a shadow world buried beneath the rhythms of ordinary town life, a presence woven in secret gatherings, unnamed circles, coded drawings. And whether or not its truths were still alive, the act of uncovering them had already begun to change the student's own voice, their own sense of safety. The deeper the student went into the diary, the less satisfied they felt with guesswork. A puzzle asks to be solved, and the fragments scattered across those crumbling pages began to itch in the back of their mind. If the diarist had cloaked their meaning in symbols and euphemisms, then deciphering them felt not just like curiosity, but a responsibility. So one evening, shoulders hunched beneath the lamp's dim circle, the student gathered their notes and drew up a plan of research. The first step was the library, not the easy comfort of the campus building they saw every day, but the quieter county library, tucked 3 bus rides away. There, among shelves that smelled of dust and faint soap, they scoured local histories. The town where the diarist had lived was not large, but its presence left scattered traces in archived maps, tiny newspapers, yearbooks preserved from long-forgotten schools. The student expected anniversaries of festivals or church records to match the diary's repeated gatherings, but pages offered nothing. Where the dates should have aligned, there were blanks. The absences unsettled them even more than conflicting information would have. It was like opening a book and finding chapters missing. In newsprint, the weekly columns about weather and crops rolled on exactly as bland as expected, but when the diary said that people met on the outskirts, the papers said only, "quiet week." That silence seemed deliberate. Puzzled, the student spread stacks of photocopied clippings across their bed back at the dorm. They constructed timelines across their wall with pushpins and thread. The gaps refused to be smoothed over. Each time an entry noted, "The circle met again," the official record slept soundly in its columns, denying any event had happened. They turned next to those fragments. The student felt a strange recognition. The diary wasn't lying. The language it used matched the broader hush that had hung over the region for decades. Determined, the student combed through municipal archives. But the more official the collection, the more gaps appeared. Government records ended in half-sentences. Marriage licenses were misfiled or missing entirely from certain families. Pages of census rolls occasionally showed blocks of names smeared or absent, as if the lists had been altered after the fact. Each hole in the record only drove the student further. There was one moment that marked a turning point. In the county annex building, they located a storage drawer of handwritten maps. The clerk who showed them the way seemed indifferent, warning that many of the maps had warped or split at the edges. Digging through the brittle sheets, the student's breath caught at a set of annotations. Certain farmsteads on the edge of the county were circled, in the exact manner the diarist had used in their margin doodles. No explanation sat beside them, just circles among otherwise neat cartography. That evening, back at the dorm, the student copied the circles onto their own research notes. They matched almost exactly with the diarist's references to the edge of town. What had seemed vague in cursive now possessed physical coordinates. Slowly, research began to shift from academic detachment to something lived. The student noticed their conversations changing. They measured how guarded they felt when mentioning the diary to a professor over coffee. The professor, polite but distracted, brushed it aside as esoteric, nothing worth a paper. Yet the student caught themselves lowering their tone, careful even here. The process of piecing together scraps also became more physical. Their desk now sagged under photocopies and scribbled timelines. Walls once decorated with posters were overtaken by taped-up diagrams. Some nights stretched past dawn, their eyes blurred, following the looping patterns of their own handwriting, repeating the diarist's symbols like echoes. During one visit to the town itself, meaning leapt off the page into physical landscape. A friend invited them to dinner, but they muttered excuses and returned to pages of notes. The world outside shrank until it revolved around blotched ink vanished maps, hushed folklore. Yet every bruised eye and missed meal felt justified, because piece by piece, the student began stitching together a picture. A group unnamed, gatherings never recorded, generations protecting silence by omission. No single document screamed proof, but collectively they wove a tapestry too patterned to dismiss. And as each day passed, the student's sense of ordinary life thinned. Research was supposed to clarify. Here, it deepened the blur. Each discovery promised explanation, but delivered deeper shadows. What had begun as curiosity became compulsion. They weren't simply transcribing an old diary anymore. They were prying at the edges of a silence long sustained, a fence built not of stone, but of secrets. The longer the student dwelled on the diary, the more their own life began to shift in unwanted ways. At first, it crept in softly. They brought up the diary once, almost casually, to a professor they trusted. Over coffee, they framed it as harmless curiosity, an old book from a flea market, filled with coded symbols. They expected a spark of interest, or at least a smile at their tenacity. Instead, the professor's expression froze for a fraction too long. Then came a quick dismissal. Some people love inventing mysteries. Best not to waste your time chasing folklore. The words were polished, but the eyes gave something away, a flicker of discomfort, as though the subject itself carried weight that should remain unspoken. Walking back across campus, the student kept replaying that hesitation. It wasn't the reaction of someone confronted with nonsense. It was the reaction of someone brushing away a topic they did not want to name. Within days, other encounters suggested the same. Mentioning the diary to a fellow graduate student led not to curiosity, but to an abrupt change of subject. The peer, who usually didn't erase the uncanny timing. The deeper they probed into the diary, the more traces pressed back against them. From then on, they felt watched. At night, walking back from the library, streetlights seemed to flare into bruised spheres of glare, and with each stretch of shadow between lamps, they half expected footsteps to fall in time with theirs. Once, climbing the stairs to their dorm, they could have sworn they heard the door below open again, but when they turned, no one entered. Another time, an elderly man at a diner glanced too long at the diary notebooks splayed on the student's table. His fork hovered inert above his plate, while his gaze lingered, unreadable. The student closed their laptop, stuffed papers away, fled into the night air. Then came silence from townspeople themselves. On a research trip to the county library's archive, the student asked an archivist about rural folklore, careful not to mention circles or choirs by name. The archivist, friendly before, suddenly muttered something about many questions better left forgotten, and excused herself to fetch another patron. She never returned. A substitute, red-faced and harried, shoved files toward the student without eye contact. The diary itself seemed to absorb this tension. Flipping through more pages late one night, the student found an entry where the author had written only a single lament. "It tightens around me, even at home, eyes." Reading those words, the student sat back, heart thudding. It mirrored their own sensations so completely, as if across decades the diarist's pulse and their pulse were the same drumbeat. and the obsession kept reshaping their daily life. Meals were skipped, friends' invitations ignored, courses neglected. On their desks sprawled more diagrams, more scrawled translations of symbols. Yet alongside that intellectual drive ran the gnawing itch of fear. Even routine sounds grew sharp, pipes humming in the wall, the crackle of heat through vents, footsteps echoing in the hall. Each became suspect. The culmination came one late afternoon. Student installed new locks, kept blinds drawn, carried the diary everywhere in a plain backpack. Yet no matter the precautions, the dread lingered, following them between classes, trailing them down sidewalks. Then, a second anonymous message appeared, this time not slipped beneath their door, but taped carefully to the mirror in the dorm's shared bathroom. Written again in rough pencil, only 3 words: "We still exist." That phrase sliced through the last thread of doubt. If before they leaned toward thinking the cult had dissolved with time, reduced to mere echoes recorded by one diarist, now they could no longer believe it gone. Somebody alive, in the present, was intent on reminding them. The student staggered back from the mirror and rinsed their face, but the words burned in their mind. Emotionally, the transformation was complete. What began as excitement over a chance find had twisted into obsession, shadowed by anxiety. Their heart raced when footsteps sounded behind them, their sleep fractured into restless fragments, haunted by imagined images of figures standing at the edge of light. Friends no longer recognized them at study groups. Professors noticed distraction sharpening into vacancy. Yet even as fear mounted, so did the pull of the diary. Pages eclipsed meals and social duties. The students' dreams and waking hours were consumed equally by the problem of decoding, of mapping symbols, of aligning dates to vanished events. They whispered to no one, but deep inside themselves they admitted the paradox. The more danger pressed close, the stronger the obsession grew. In one late-night reflection, they finally put it into words. Knowledge was no longer information. It was contagion. The diarist, decades ago, had been infected by silence, compelled to write without writing. And now that same silence had spread to them, shaping their habits, bending their speech. By the time winter frost clinched hard on the streets outside, their old life had thinned into something unrecognizable. Circles, overlapping triangles mapped next to diary dates, long lists of repeated phrases. The walls began to look like the inside of an investigator's office. But instead of connecting photographs of crimes, each thread led back to pen scratches in browned paper. It was during one of these sessions that rhythm started to appear. The symbols weren't random decoration. They belonged to cycles. Thursdays and Saturdays, yes, but also alignments with full moons and equinoxes hidden between lines about planting or meals. The author never wrote rituals, but the coded imagery hinted at some kind of gathering tied to natural cycles. The circle symbol, once dismissed as doodle, now looked like a compass clocking time toward events meant to stay unwritten. The student found themselves reading more and more in whispers. When the author used euphemisms like the circle or the quiet choir, the student mouthed them silently, aware of how forbidden they felt. In one particularly chilling entry, the diarist scribbled, "They call, though we call nothing. If I write the name, I am no longer mine." The word struck them harder than any symbol. It meant the absence itself was deliberate. Naming was the forbidden act, resisted so frantically that even in private ink the diarist refused it. Silence here wasn't forgetfulness. It was discipline, a wall maintained by terror. As translation deepened, the diary stopped appearing like a record of events and more like an instructional manual wrapped in metaphor. "The hand is held until no voice resists," repeated in different variations. Alone it could be poetic, but mapping it alongside symbols, the student began to picture initiation rites, sessions where obedience was rehearsed, tested, sealed. Another fragment. "Bread divided, salt withheld." Once matched with local folklore mentioning meals withheld to bind outsiders, it began to carry the chilling resonance of psychological conditioning. The marginal doodles grew darker under scrutiny. At first, vague faces, but with patient tracing, the student mean. To the student's mind, it suggested that defectors weren't just punished. Their very memory was struck out, as if naming them would poison the group's cohesion. They compared it to entire blocks of censuses missing in the municipal archives. The pattern aligned too precisely to dismiss. What kept gnawing at them was the diarist's tone. The entries shifted from curiosity to resignation, then to paranoia. By the late sections, even ordinary sentences about weather or food carried a twitch of fear. Phrases like "safe only in quiet" appeared between bakery notes and lists of seeds. It was a voice cracking under pressure, pulled between wanting to record truth and obeying invisible threats. The student saw their own hand mirrored there. Their own life was becoming penciled margins filled with obsessive shorthand. One night, in frustration, the students spread the diary, notes, and maps in a circle around themselves on the floor, like sitting in the center of a strange ceremony. They sketched and cross-referenced for hours, lining up dates with lunar tables downloaded from astronomical archives. When the patterns locked in place, the air in the room felt different. It was unmistakable. The diarist's gatherings matched cycles of light and dark. The so-called choir moved in unison with old calendars, a design far too structured to be accident. And then, another revelation. The euphemism "quiet choir" appeared most often beside those crude sketches of mouths half erased. The student jolted upright, adrenaline quaking. What if the phrase wasn't poetic at all? What if it was literal? Voices muted, mouths silenced. A choir whose only song was absence of sound. The imagery weighed heavy, because once seen, it could no longer be unseen. At the same time, the diary gave no overt confession. It forever stopped short of direct statement. That restraint tormented the student most. Each page whispered, "Something is here," but never screamed it. That made the burden heavier, because the student alone was piecing it together, forced to infer the unspeakable. Outside the study sessions, life yielding. They had uncovered patterns of gatherings, glimpses of coercion, hints of disappearances. They had seen how naming was forbidden, how silence itself operated as doctrine. But perhaps the most unsettling realization was personal. The diary was no longer just text. It was mirror. In decoding its language, they were following the same descent the author had traced decades ago. Entry by entry, their own life and the diarist's life converged, until their notes and the diary pages seemed to belong to one combined voice. The mirror effect terrified them, but also hinted that the final pages might already contain the fate awaiting anyone who read too far. The decision to leave the comfort of campus and follow the diary's clues felt reckless, even in the moment. But curiosity had swollen into something bigger than reason. The maps and symbols taped across their walls all pointed outward, urging a step into geography rather than just memory. So, one gray Saturday morning, the student stuffed the diary into a backpack, borrowed a car from a friend who never asked questions, and drove toward the blurred county edges mentioned again and again in the entries. The road narrowed quickly, pavement giving way to cracked gravel. Trees leaned inward, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the daylight. At certain bends, the quiet deepened until the hum of tires sounded like intrusion. The student clutched the wheel tighter, the diary's weight pressing from the seat beside them. The words "edge of town" rang like a chant, and they kept asking themselves, why always here? Eventually, the road ended near farmland gone half wild. Waist-high grass swallowed what had once been fences. In the distance slouched an abandoned farmhouse, its roof sagging, windows punched out like dark sockets. It matched, almost exactly, one of the circled coordinates glimpsed on that faded county map. Heart pounding, the student parked and stepped out. Every sound, an insect buzz, the thump of a car door, echoing too loudly in the open air. As they walked closer, the farmhouse carried signs of more than decay. A stone near the porch bore shallow carvings. Posture was bent, hands thrust deep into frayed coat pockets, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a cap. The student hesitated, forcing polite words. "Excuse me. Do you know anything about this place?" The man didn't move for a moment. Then his cracked voice rasped out softly. "Best to leave." His eyes flicked not at the house, but at the backpack slung across the student's shoulder. "Some pages ain't for reading." "I found a diary," the student admitted, voice shaking with courage and fear. "It mentioned gatherings here. A circle. A choir." The man's jaw clenched. A long silence thickened between them, broken only by wind rattling the dry grass. Finally, he whispered, "They told us never to name them. Once you name what should stay unnamed, there's no turning back. You already walked too close." Then, as quickly as he came, he shuffled away into the wooded edge, leaving the student chilled. The sun dipped lower, shadows sharpened. The student lingered, sketching more of the etched stones, trying to anchor themselves in the safety of academic record. But as dusk settled, a new sound grew, soft crunching of steps among dead leaves. At first faint, then unmistakable. They froze, straining their ears. The woods behind the farmhouse seemed empty, yet footsteps persisted, moving slowly, deliberately. Their skin prickled. Trying to summon logic, they whispered, "Could be deer." But each pause of their breath was met with another measured crunch, too heavy, too timed. Fear surged. Gathering their belongings, they sprinted for the car. Branches snapped behind them, but when they glanced over their shoulder, they saw nothing, only the jagged dark between trees. Heart hammering, they flung open the car door, spilled inside, and locked it with trembling fingers. The diary lay where they'd placed it, silent yet alive, as though pleased to have proved its power. The engine roared awake. Gravel spat from the tires as they pulled back onto the narrow road. Only when miles passed and the open fields returned did they loosen their grip on the steering wheel. Sweat soaked the student admitted a truth they had resisted. This was no longer academic. They had crossed a boundary. There were traces in stone, reluctance in the old man's voice, threaded footsteps chasing them through woods. The cult, or whatever it had been, wasn't a ghost story sealed in old ink. It lived in the present, hidden but alert, and they knew, deep in their bones, that the diary had always meant to lead them here. Back in the safety of their dorm room, the students sat with the diary open across their knees and the memory of crunching footsteps in the woods still echoing in their skull. The farmhouse had shown them that not everything stayed confined to the past. But now, driven by equal parts fear and determination, they knew the next step had to be sharper. They needed names. The diary's euphemisms, circle, choir, sleepless, were no longer enough. They needed to uncover who these people had been and, if possible, who they had become. Pulling their laptop closer, the student began combing genealogy databases, the kind that let you sift through censuses, marriage licenses, and centuries-old courthouse records. They hunched closer to the glare of the screen, tapping names penciled faintly in the diary, initials, small first names, to see if any connection took shape. Most were ordinary enough, but patterns soon stirred. Clusters of surnames repeated in the diarist's lists of daily visits, bread sharing, or roadside help. Cross-referenced, those surnames still existed in the town's records well into the 21st century. That realization sent a prickling along the student's arms. Families named but never directly accused in the diary were still rooted in the civic life of the present. They pulled courthouse records from microfilm, the humming projector spilling pale light into the quiet archive room. Hours passed, entries blurred, but certain surnames returned like stubborn chorus lines. One family appeared consistently in positions of trust, clerks, notaries, even a county judge half a century later. Another surfaced in business licenses. Development projects had been launched by, again, the same family names. Land never released, only transformed. The diary's note of bread divided, salt withheld at the West Field, now mapped directly onto corporate farmland run by that lineage. The continuity was chilling. Walking back across campus that evening, the student couldn't shake the image of their peers chatting casually about internships, professors conducting lectures, a whole ordinary world moving forward. And yet parallel to it, beneath it, a second current ran. Smiling business owners and static town elders carried surnames weighted with silence. That night they returned to the dorm ready for rest, but encountered something that tangled the present even more. Their door opened without resistance, though they were certain they had locked it. Inside, everything seemed undisturbed at first, but on the desk, the diary sat not as they had left it, but slanted open. A slip of paper, not original to the book, peered from its belly. In faint penciled letters, "We still exist. Stop here." The student buckled against the desk, breath short. This was no relic of past terror. This was present tense. Someone had been inside, close enough to know where the diary rested, careful enough not to steal, but to remind. The words confirmed what genealogy had already implied. The thread of secrecy had not broken. Desperation drove them back into research, as if to make the lurking threat manageable. They combed digitized newspapers for published photographs, ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, fundraisers. In Face After Face, they found those surnames smiling back at them from sepia years to digital features. Ordinary faces, yet behind every face the diary's whispers drummed. One night they assembled the materials across their floor, diary open to sketches of choirs without hymns, census records scarred with smudged blocks, municipal yearbooks showing neat rows of town officials. They placed them side by side, present touching past. The air in the room thickened, as if history itself recognized the mirror. The diary entries from its final section grew heavier, darker. The writer no library. The dorm room looked untouched, but when they dropped their bag, they saw the diary angled slightly different. Breath quickened. They flipped through quickly, nothing gone. Yet a tiny thumbprint darker than paper oil sat on the page describing, "Failure to keep silence brings unmaking." Whoever had moved it had read there deliberately. Fingers trembling, the student whispered aloud the words they had resisted. "They're still here." Speaking it felt treacherous, as if crossing into the forbidden act of naming. The shadows in the room stiffened. With heart pounding, they slid the diary beneath piles of notebooks, pushed the desk chair hard against the window, and lay down with eyes wide open. They barely slept. Even when they drifted, dreams replayed the diarist's steady decline, ending in erasure. Come morning, their gaze fell again on the genealogy charts spreading across their wall. Each arrow, each connection, was no longer just historical, but a line pointing to living authority in the town. Past had met present, and the certainty carved into their chest was unbearable. The silence wasn't relic. It was living order, disguised as ordinary town life. Every thread they had pulled led here, to this convergence. The dead diarist's warnings, the smothered census, the etched stones in farmhouses, the footsteps in the woods, all whispered the same truth. This was not simply academic exploration anymore. A cult no one dared to name still breathed in anonymous faces and sealed records, their power perpetuated through silence. And the student, clutching the diary tighter than ever, knew with bone-deep clarity. They had slipped too far into its current. They were not just researching history. They were trespassing in the territory of the living. The days that followed blurred into a strange half-life. The student felt caught between two worlds, the old life of classes, friends, and surface concerns, and the new, inescapable orbit of the diary. Conversations with peers became hollow. Lectures slipped past without meaning. Every moment outside the dorm felt staged, like watching actors move through scenes while their own reality pulsed elsewhere. Every casual conversation felt like a trap. If they mentioned the diary aloud, who might overhear? And if they kept silent, what explanations could they invent to justify the distance growing between themselves and everyone else? The diary's presence amplified this alienation. Each entry deepened in darkness as they pressed forward. Early mentions of gatherings gave way to ominous accounts where the diarist described rituals clouded in half-phrases, hands bound, words withheld. Those who faltered, absent after. Again and again, the pattern sharpened. Restriction, punishment, disappearance. The student traced the words slowly, recognizing their own reflection in the tension between confession and concealment. What unnerved them most was the way their own writing changed. In notebooks scattered across the desk, their handwriting shifted into cramped, feverish bursts. Lists of dates, coded diagrams, fragments of interpretation. It no longer resembled orderly research. It looked closer to obsession. Looking down at those filled pages, they realized with a shiver that they mirrored the diarist's descent. The same isolation, the same alienation from surrounding life, as though the diary itself was not just evidence, but an infection, breeding repetition through every hand that touched it. The more they studied, the more alone they felt. Even trusted professors seemed part of the silence. Questions raised were brushed aside. A casual mention of strange folklore at office hours met with polite deflection, followed by the quick closing of a conversation. It was as if the entire academic world conspired to signal, some doors must not be opened. But the student had already stepped through, and behind them the door had locked. Paranoia became constant companion. They jumped at the sound of footsteps in hallways, turned suddenly at the faintest whispers of laughter outside their door. At night, they double-checked locks and still couldn't close their eyes completely. Worse still were the intrusions, the diary tilted askew on the desk, copies of notes shuffled as if read in haste. No theft occurred, nothing obvious disturbed, but that choice carried deeper menace. To be studied without harm is to be told. Long passages described the silence imposed at climactic rituals, the moment when dissenters fell quiet, not from choice, but from enforcement. They sang with no voices, one entry read, and I felt mine slipping. These words echoed fiercely inside the student's chest. Reading them was like confronting a mirror already written decades ago, showing what awaited those who questioned silence. The mirror effect blurred boundaries further. When they reread entries describing vanished members, they thought instantly of themselves. The ostracism from peers, the effaced presence in ordinary campus life. The past diarist's erasure looked less like distant tragedy and more like foreshadowing of their own fate. And in that realization lay the most menacing question. Was the act of uncovering this story worth the erosion of their mind? Some nights the question wavered close to an answer. Staring at piled notes, they asked themselves if leaving would be possible. Could the diary be locked away somewhere, buried again and forgotten? But even imagining that brought no comfort. The pull was too deep. Their body craved the revelation even as their mind feared its cost. In that contradiction they saw the true design of silence. It infects until you cannot turn away, until you fracture from the pressure of carrying knowledge alone. By the end of winter, the student's world had narrowed to a pinhole. Each hour rotated around pages darkened by ink. Friends faded. Professors grew wary. Even their own breath seemed heavy in quiet rooms. They were tethered only to the diary, pulled without choice into its dark current. And as they sat one night with trembling hands smoothing its cracked spine, they understood. Discovery was not a triumph. It was a trade. They had traded trust, calm, connection, and perhaps sanity itself for the privilege of hearing whispers no one else dared name. The diary's last section felt heavier than paper should. The student turned the pages with slow hands, sensing the end approaching the way one feels the hush before a door slams. The handwriting in these final entries was jagged, rushed. Someone inscribed their own final steps. This was not speculation. This was confession. And worse, It aligned with an unsolved case the student had stumbled across in newspaper archives. A young adult who had vanished from the very county at the same time the diary ended. The disappearance, marked as a missing persons case, never solved, quietly forgotten. A chill struck deeper than research. This was the diarist's face, pressed against their own, decades apart, bound by a silence that had stalked them both. The cult's power had not only killed or erased, but ensured, through fear, that the very name could never be spoken. The diary confirmed it by omission as much as writing. Never once was the group directly named. Instead, the void itself carried meaning. Silence, weaponized into survival. The student leaned back, staring at walls covered with notes. For months they had followed fragments with academic hunger, thinking persistence would break the mystery. But now the realization hit like a blow. The absence itself was design. To name them out loud was the deepest forbidden act. That was why public records failed, why genealogies blurred, why professors stiffened, why strangers warned. Decades of silence had been cultivated to preserve power. By trying to pierce that wall, the student had already risked stepping where survival demanded retreat. The question cracked open inside them. What now? To hold knowledge was one thing, but to act on it, publish, expose, shout, that would be another. The diary's warning loomed. Transparency exactly invited destruction. To reveal everything would risk their life, perhaps their sanity. Yet, to say nothing meant honoring the cult's imposed silence. Panic and resolve wrestled as they paced their room. They could imagine consequences clearly. A sudden disappearance explained away, a body lost in the woods, a life dismissed as stress or accident. These people had erased others before. They could again. And yet, another image sharpened alongside it. Generations remaining unchallenged, free to manipulate in dark anonymity. The student drew themselves to the desk and began drafting. Not a bold student returned the diary to its box, sealing it again, pressing the faded lid down until it snapped shut. They folded their hands for a long moment, listening to their own breath. This choice marked the boundary between life and erasure. They would live quietly, hyper-vigilant, changed forever. But the truth, in shreds, would move beyond them. The final act was not triumph, but haunting choice. To survive, they had to remain partly silent. Yet by leaking traces, they had already whispered against silence itself. It was not victory. It was survival. And as their eyes drifted closed in that exhausted dawn, the knowledge lived heavy in their chest. Once you read too far, you never leave unchanged. Morning arrived with a gray quiet. The student woke to the sight of loose pages strewn across the desk, and the diary once more sealed in its box. Their body ached with exhaustion, yet the deeper ache was in their mind. The hollow sense that what they had uncovered was not done with them. Life after revelation was not a return to normalcy. It was a life shaped by vigilance, by the knowledge that silence itself had power, and enemies rarely announced themselves aloud. In the weeks that followed, trust thinned into something fragile. They walked through campus with shoulders drawn tighter, every glance from a stranger analyzed, every sound behind them weighed for hidden meaning. Friends asked fewer questions now, having grown tired of distance. Professors noted absences but no longer pressed for explanations. Outwardly, life resumed its pattern. But inwardly, each moment was colored by the memory of coded symbols and voices stifled in ink. The diary returned to hiding. It was sealed in a heavy wooden box, then tucked deep within an innocuous trunk in the back of their closet. Yet, even hidden, its presence felt constant. At night, they imagined hearing the faint crack following, voices singing, nothing at all. Waking life was marked by hypervigilance, keys gripped between fingers when walking, blinds tightened against the night, breaths held too long when elevators stalled between floors. They laughed less, spoke less freely, and feared the moment when their obsession might slip unwittingly into casual conversation. Even joy felt dangerous. Smiling too openly with friends could mean forgetting caution. Music that once brought ease now rang suspicious, each chorus echoing the silence of the choir. Their mind, looping through memory, returned again and again to the marginal scrawl. Better to scatter words than lose a tongue. That phrase stuck like a splinter. To them, it meant every action from here on had to balance disclosure and secrecy, truth and survival. Time passed, months thinning the immediacy of fear into a steadier hum. But it never disappeared. Sitting alone in cafes, the student would sometimes spot an older figure watching too long, then turning away. Walking down a street, they would read a surname on a law office plaque and feel the shiver of continuity. The records they had copied confirmed it. Bloodlines had carried silence forward, adapting to each decade, which meant the cult, whether meeting formally or surviving as habit, still existed, not always as cloaked rituals in barns, but as structured avoidance that governed entire families. The student's role was now complicated. They were not a whistleblower in a courtroom, but neither were they a passive archivist. By scattering encrypted fragments anonymously, they had shifted silence, if only slightly. They had made erasure less perfect. That choice brought no triumph. It brought responsibility and dread in equal measure. Each day they wondered, had anyone noticed those digital seeds? Would some stranger, decades ahead, stumble on them the way they had stumbled on the diary? And through it all, the emotional burden weighed most heavily. Curiosity had once felt like their companion. Now, curiosity, this old, this carefully constructed, did not end when revealed. They seeped into the present, lodging in the hearts of those who dared to uncover them. And so the student lived on, changed, alert, and unable to return to innocence. Each day reminded them of the cult's most powerful weapon, silence itself, still alive, still unnamed. The final image is simple. A wooden box, heavy, tucked into the shadows of a closet. Inside it rests the cracked leather diary that set everything into motion. Its spine is locked tight, its pages pressed together as if holding back a whisper. Around it lies silence, thick, unbroken. but a silence that feels alive, the kind that carries an echo waiting for another careless hand to lift the lid. You can picture the student placing it there with deliberate care. They do not slam the trunk shut or hide it in panic. Instead, they pause, as if listening for one last murmur from the paper sealed inside. Because objects like this never feel fully inert. They breathe faintly in the imagination, whispering danger even when tucked away where sunlight cannot reach. And that is where the story leaves us, not with victory, not with resolution, but with that muted heartbeat of knowledge waiting in the dark. The diary is not destroyed, its words are not gone. They vibrate faintly through the student's life, mirrored in every wary glance over the shoulder, every encrypted copy scattered in quiet corners of the internet. Some secrets never die, they only hide, waiting for voices willing or foolish enough to find them again. In one sentence, the truth becomes clear. The cult was never defeated. Its silence simply seeped into the present day. It endures precisely because it is never spoken aloud. Its greatest strength is this hush, this insistence that naming means peril. That silence becomes law not by decree, but by inheritance, passed down until even those untouched by ritual flinch from naming at all. And now, by pulling open an old diary, the student has joined that cycle of silence, bearing the weight of it across the naming, the more power that silence accrues. So you sit now with the same choice the student faced. Do you close the lid and treat it as a story consumed, a cautionary tale left behind? Or do you acknowledge the strange weight that comes when words are hidden, when truths are buried in deliberate quiet? The danger does not arise from knowing names alone. It arises from sensing how quickly silence can corrode the ordinary, until distrust is all that remains. This story refuses a perfect ending because secrets like these refuse to be sealed by conclusions. They thrive in open-endedness, in the dread that what was hidden still moves just out of sight. You are left to imagine the student, years from now, still glancing over their shoulder, still checking locks twice, still hearing phantom footsteps in the woods when the night grows too deep. Their life reshaped, not by confrontation, but by the permanence of what they read. And maybe that is the heart of it. Not that the diary spoke of rituals or of vanished members, not that it described a choir without sound, but that it proved silence itself can outlast death. Generations sustain it, strangers enforce it, and the living learn how to obey it without ever being told aloud. When the camera of memory pans back, the closet remains closed, the diary sealed once more. Yet in your ears, you can almost hear the hushed rustle of its pages, still whispering danger beneath the weight of wood and dust. That soft pressure is the echo you carry away, a reminder that some voices, erased or forbidden, do not vanish. They live on, waiting quietly until someone like you listens. What happens next is not mine to tell. It waits in your hesitation, in whether you replay this story, in whether you dare to imagine what lies unwritten between the diary's lines. For the moment, all that remains is the hush, the lingering thrum of a secret unnamed, bleeding its silence into your present. Stay with that feeling, unsettling as it is,